Hey, Joe Gilder here, back for part two as we think through the recording process and what that looks like, specifically what it looks like for me, but hopefully there's a lot in here that you can apply to your process, maybe some things that you're skipping over, or maybe maybe to help simplify it a little bit and put it into some bubbles that are easier to kind of wrap your head around. The end result of all of this, why would I do a video like this? Why would I do any of the videos that I do? Is I want to help you make more music. There are a lot of people I talk to who get into recording. They learn how to do things like EQ and compression and reverb and delay and all those things. And they learn the best way to mic an acoustic guitar, and they learn tips for miking a lead vocal and all these things that are fabulous and great. But they have this big kind of thorn in their side of not finishing anything they've started. They begin things pretty well, but they at some point get overwhelmed. They run out of time. They become really insecure about actually releasing something. Just any number of things. And the reason I know this is because I'm the same way. I struggle with all those same things. And I think for me, one of the big kind of saving graces for me is knowing what the next step is. I've used this analogy before, and you're probably annoyed with me if you've heard me do it a few times, but if you've not seen the movie The Martian or read the book, it's the one with Matt Damon, not the book, but the movie. He's stranded on Mars, and his team has left. They're heading back to Earth. No one else is going to be there for another, I forget how long it is, a couple years before another mission will come to Mars. And so he literally has to figure out how to survive. And the whole book is you're kind of reading it as like his journal entries into this log. And he's saying, okay, I ran into this problem today and this problem. I know I'm going to have to think about this problem. I'm going to run out of food here on this day. I got to figure out how to grow more food. But in the meantime, I got to figure out how to make more water. In the meantime, I got to figure out how to make this dirt into something that will grow food. And he has all these things he's thinking about, but then he realizes that the next thing I've got to do is this, and that's what I'm going to do. And there's this calm nature about him that I found to be really soothing, because he's looking at, recording music will never be life-threatening, right? It'll never be a life and death thing. It can feel that way sometimes, but it will never be that. But even seeing someone in a life and death situation, and I know it's fiction, but seeing how calm he was and how he took what was seemingly obviously overwhelming, and with a few freakouts throughout the book and the movie, for the most part, he just kind of calmly stayed the course of doing the next right thing, the next right thing, the next right thing. So you can apply that same rigor, that same calm focus to your music. And I think if you do that consistently, I know you'll start releasing stuff. You'll start finishing projects, and you'll start better. The biggest thing you can do to get better at a creative task is to do it a lot, to do it well, to learn the right techniques and all that stuff. But once you know a good chunk of information and knowledge about it, the only thing left to do is to do it, and then to finish it, and then to start the process again. At the time I'm shooting this video, I've released 3 full-length albums and 2 4-song EPs over the last 7 years. And this year, I've released 1 EP already. It's the second week of March, and I'll be releasing 4 more this year. Why would I do that? Well, A, I want to make music. B, I like a good challenge. And C, it makes me better. Nothing makes me better more than releasing music, okay? So with that big preamble, let's talk about the second bubble of this process. So the last video, we talked about pre-production, how we do things like make charts and record scratch tracks and get everything ready for the recording process. And so I almost see it like Mickey Mouse ears. You got pre-production, which is super important but doesn't take that much time. Then you've got the big bubble in the middle. That's Mickey's head. This is his ear, his head. Big bubble of recording and everything that involves. And then the other bubble of mixing and mastering. Now, some people make this mixing and mastering bubble his huge deformed tumor on the side of Mickey's head, but it doesn't have to be if you get this big bubble right. So we're going to talk about that quite a bit. Now, I used to talk about this in years past of there being more like 5 phases to this whole process, and I really think that's just making it overly complicated. For me, this middle bubble, this recording phase, if we want to call it that, is really more like the creation phase. Where you are between the preparation phase, pre-production, and when you start mixing, you're doing everything that needs to be done to get it ready for mixing. So you can almost call it the pre-mixing phase. That's not exciting at all. So don't call it the pre-mixing phase, but you get the idea. The idea is when I'm done with this section, I could sit down and mix this song without having to record or edit or tune anything. I can just get to mixing and finish mixing. Or I could take the tracks and send them to someone else, and have them mix it. So for me, that process, and I'm going to talk about it in context of probably a full band project because that's the most involved. But as you can imagine, it's all kind of the same. So once we have our scratch tracks, we've got our sessions set up. Let's say I just recently did this with a 4-song EP. It was actually going to be 5, ended up cutting one of the songs. So I had 5 songs that I had recorded scratch tracks for, I had written charts for, had everything mapped out to a tempo, I had the sessions created, and it was time to bring the drummer and bass player over to my studio and record the kind of bass rhythm section for the project. So the way that worked for me is I took my scratch tracks that I'd created and I imported them into a new session, because the original session was just a couple of tracks and I knew I needed, all the tracks for the drums, all the tracks for bass. I'd like to have all my buses and effects and everything that I have in a template. I like to have that in the session so that couple weeks down the road when it's time to mix, I've got all that in place and I'm not having to create it one by one in each session. So I opened a new session, created with all my buses that I want, then created all the drum tracks, the bass tracks, some extra guitar tracks, and then I imported those scratch tracks that I created. Obviously, you got to make sure that you export them starting at a downbeat, starting at 0, so that it lines up, and you have to set the tempo of your new session to the exact tempo of the other one. Those are easy things to do. And then I brought them in, and so now I've got this big session with all the tracks ready to record, and I've got these couple of tracks of guitars and a scratch vocal that we're listening to as we play. And so I sent the scratch tracks to my musicians a few days before, just so they could listen to them. I didn't send them the raw tracks. I just mixed them down, said, hey, here are the songs in their most basic form. Take a listen. I don't know if everybody listened to them. I know the drummer did. Bass player was Brent Milligan. I don't know if he listened to him or not, but he's the kind of guy who can just look at a chart and knock it out, which is crazy. So they come in, ideally they know the songs. Or, if you're in a band and these are your songs that you've been playing as a band for years, then yeah, they know the songs already coming in. In that instance, it is still important to do this. You may think, yeah, we know the song, we've played it 1,000 times, we can come in and knock it out. And that may be true. But I've had so many sessions where you've played the song 1,000,000 times, you know the song, but when it comes down to actually recording, you finish the first chorus and then you can't remember if you play the turnaround 1 time or 2 times. And you can't remember if it's 4 bars or 8 bars. And then you can't remember how long you held out that note in the bridge or whatever. Like all these different, and everybody's thinking, no, I think it's this. No, I think it's this. Hang on, let's play it. And you play it and say, well, I don't think that's right. Let's try this. Nothing wrong with that. That's, part of being in a group of musicians and playing music. But it would be so much easier if someone, the person who wrote the song, the lead singer or whatever, whoever, sat down and wrote a chart and then everyone played off the chart. And then I mentioned this in the last video. If you're doing that and someone says, hey guys, I think we need to play that turnaround twice as long. I think that's what we do sometimes when we play this out live. Everyone can look and say, oh yes, I see right here that the turnaround is only 4 bars and we normally do play at 8 bars. That does sound right. Okay, let's just write that in and change that. That's an easy thing to change. But if everybody's operating from memory and everybody's memory is a little shot, especially if you're on like the 6th song of the day and everybody's starting to kind of lose their focus, it's so nice to have this. You can almost be mindless if you have a chart in front of you. So you just follow along. It's like follow the bouncing ball. I'm just staring at the chart while I play. And I don't have to think about, okay, what's the vocalist singing here? I don't have to think about, okay, what's happening next? What's happening next? I know exactly what's happening next because it's right here on this roadmap, okay? So, assuming everyone, whether you all know the songs or you're bringing in musicians that have never heard the music before in your life, once you have the chart ready, everybody listens through and you start recording. So there's so many things, I obviously can't go through and say, all right, here's the best way to do a kick drum, here's the best way to do a snare drum, best way to record bass. I've got plenty of videos and things around that. This is more about the process. But there is one key concept that you've probably heard me talk about. Unless this is your first video you've ever seen from me, if so, hi, welcome. My name is Joe. Nice to see you. Unless this is your first video from me, you've heard me say this before, and I should have worn the t-shirt, but I forgot. But It's this dumb phrase that I say over and over, and it's simply get it right at the source. Okay. If you find yourself, once you're in recording phase and you're in the recording bubble, it is time to spend every second that you're in the studio, everything you work on is focused on one thing, and that is making it sound right. If you find yourself starting to revert back to thinking, we can fix that later. That guitar tone kind of sucks, but I bet I can fix it with EQ later. Or that guitar tone sucks, but we're going to just record a direct signal and I'll use an amp model software later. Nothing wrong with that, but I say, man, commit to the sound up front. Get the tone to sound right now. Don't wait to do it later. You're giving yourself more stuff to do in the future, and you're giving yourself more options. And one of the biggest enemies of productivity in a home studio is too many options. Having too many things to do, too many choices, which is why I go for simple. I go for, hey, that guitar tone's not good. Why don't you change guitars? Why don't you change pedals? Why don't you change the settings on the amp? Why don't we try this different amp? Something to make it where it's coming out of the speakers without any processing on it, it sounds good. If you can live by that simple little get it right at the source principle, I promise your recordings will sound infinitely better and your mixes will also sound better. See, that's the thing. I don't just do it for the sake of doing it. I don't just make good recordings and hound, almost be a stickler for making sure that we have good recordings just for the heck of it. I do it because I know it's going to make the mixing process that much easier. There have been so many people, and we'll talk about this when we talk about mixing, so many people who come to me and ask me for help learning how to mix, how to get better mixes. And so much of my response to them focuses on the recording. And if they ever join one of my courses or dueling mixes or something that I do where we're mixing tracks, and if they ever import those tracks into their session and hear what good, well-recorded tracks sound like, occasionally this light bulb moment happens for them and they realize, oh, see, I've been recording these kind of garbage tracks, and then I've been spending all of my time trying to find the perfect combination of plugins to make them sound amazing. So I go and I watch Pensado's Place. I watch Graham over the Recording Revolution. I watch this weird guy named Joe Gilder on Home Studio Corner, and they show me all these things they do with plugins, and I try to do what they do, and I don't get the same results. I must be a bad mix engineer. I have good news and bad news. The good news is you're probably not a bad mix engineer. The bad news is you're probably a bad recording engineer. Or at least you're just not good yet, or you've just not given it the importance that it deserves and needs, okay? So what'll happen is they'll import these tracks that sound good, and they'll turn up the faders, and they'll realize, hey, this sounds good already. I've gotten so many emails like that. So I've got a product that I sell called Mix Practice, okay? And all it is the multi-track files for all the songs I've ever released from all the albums. So as I'm shooting this video, there's like 42 songs in there. And when you join, you get access to those, and then if I release more songs in the future, like the other 3 EPs I'm going to release this year, then they get access to those as well for free. So what'll happen is they'll finally make the time to import one of the songs, and they'll just pull up the faders, and then they'll stop and email me and say, Joe, this already sounds like a mix. I mean, the tracks were so well recorded, it already sounds good. I can't believe how easy it's going to be to mix this. And it's this big epiphany for them. I don't tell you that to brag on myself. I'm thankful that I came across, that I got to the point of realizing how important the recording part is, because I did the same thing. I would record things crappily, that's a word, and then I would spend all my time trying to mix them. That's why, remember the Mickey Mouse ears? You got pre-production, mixing, and mastering. Those should be smaller parts of the process, at least in my head. Biggest part should be the recording, the getting it right at the source part of the process. Because if you do that well, then mixing just becomes adding a little taste of something here, making a little few adjustments here, blending things together nicely here. It becomes much, much, much easier. So what are some ways or kind of guiding principles that you can take through the recording process? Because recording drums is very different from recording harmonica, which is very different from recording violin, which is very different from recording acoustic guitar. What are some kind of guiding principles that you can take with you to help you to get it right at the source, right? Well, there's one very simple approach, and I'll share with you this approach in the context of how I failed to do that very recently. Okay, so I mentioned the EP that I just released. So drummer and bass player come over. I've got everything. I've been in the studio, plugging in microphones and setting up headphone mixes and getting everything ready, making decisions about which mics go where. Because I have enough microphones to do it, but you have to make some decisions. It's not like I have the perfect mic for every single scenario. So I'm saying, well, which of these two mics would be better on the on the hi-hat mic? Let's try this one. So making a lot of those decisions, having a lot of fun, but it's fairly stressful because they're going to show up at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I've been in here just kind of plugging cables and trying to get things set up. So we finally get everything plugged in. I can see that I've got signal from all the microphones. Everything's routed properly. Step one is done. So then we go to get drum sounds. And for some reason, I told him to just play, and I just pulled up all the faders, and we just listened. So he's in the other room playing, and we're listening to what the whole kit sounds like. And so I listen, and I say, all right, let me adjust all the preamps to get the levels right, make sure nothing's clipping. And then I adjust the kick drum and add a little compression and EQ on that one. And then I go to the snare and I add a little EQ and I say, I want to really compress that snare so it's nice and snappy. And so I do, and it sounds good to me, and I move on. Fast forward to the next day. So we record 5 songs that day. Fast forward to the next day, I come down to the studio. No, it might even be that night or that afternoon after they left. I come down to the studio and just want to listen. And I go through, and I've got a session pulled up, much like the one here on the screen. This is one of the songs from that EP. And I just start listening. And I think, okay, the snare isn't coming through. It's not hitting me as hard. Let me turn it up. And I turn it up, and it still doesn't sound that great. And so I go and I solo the snare. And what I hear, I'll even play it for you. Hang on, here it is. If you've never recorded drums before, that is not a good snare drum recording. What happened was I way overcompressed it with the compressor. It was pretty fast attack. The compressor compressed way too much, and I didn't get any really good sound out of that snare. It got compressed way, way, way too much. I remember on about the 3rd or 4th song looking over and seeing the meter, the gain reduction meter on this really nice preamp, really bouncing a lot with the snare. And I thought, well, I guess that's just what the sound we wanted. And so a couple of lessons there. First of all, you got to listen to every microphone by itself and make sure that it sounds like you want it to sound. Yes, what really matters is how it sounds in the context of the entire mix, which is what I was doing. I moved all the faders up and I listened to everything. But in doing that, you still have to make sure individual parts are right and are recording properly and have the right tone that you want. And it's certainly a trial and error thing. But for me, I was rushed. I wanted to get to recording. I didn't want these guys to be waiting around much longer. And everything sounded okay. And that's both a good and a bad thing. So between the room mic and the overhead mics, and there was an extra kind of fat mic that we used, I was getting a good snare tone with all those combined, but I really ruined that top snare mic. So on this EP, which is called Someone to Blame, you can go listen to it. You'll notice the snare drum, it's pretty back in the mix because it's just not a great sounding snare. And I was able to get an overall pretty good snare tone, but I had to rely really heavily on the bottom snare mic instead of the top one. And it didn't sound as good as it could have sounded. I decided not to do sample replacement. I thought that didn't sound any better based on the music and the stuff that I'd already recorded. But that's an example of what not to do. And hopefully also an encouragement to you that you can be doing this for years and years like I have, and you can still royally screw up. I was in a session just the other day where there was this guy with lots of experience, and there was a big mistake made, and it just happens, right? And you're like, I'm kind of glad it wasn't me, but you're also like, I'm really relieved that other people make mistakes too, because I botched that snare drum recording the other week. So what should I have done? Just to be clear, what I should have done is, yes, you want to listen to what all the drum kits sound like together, all the mics sound like together. That's honestly the ultimate goal, is to get to where you pull up all the drums, all the mics, and it sounds great like that. But the problem is I started there. What I should have done is solo the kick drum and had him play. If you've been to a big studio, you've seen this. They do it 1,000 times. Give me the kick drum, and they hit the kick drum, and you just listen to the kick drum mic. You make adjustments, then you move on to the snare, and then the toms, and then the overheads, and all that. I didn't do that for whatever reason. I'd had him play the kick drum, but I was listening to everything. That's how I mix. When I'm in a mixing session, I'm not going to listen to the kick drum and solo too much because I want it to sound good in context. You can't take that same approach with recording or something like this will happen. So what I should have done is soloed each one, given it the attention that it needs, and then switched over to listening to all of them and make sure that that's also working in the mix of the microphones. So that's the big, if there was one thing to think about, maybe if there were two things to think about in the recording process, get it right at the source and then listen back to what you've recorded. So if you're like most home studio folks, maybe the drummer is not in the other room, he's right behind you. So you've all got headphones on and you can't really get a good idea of what the recording sounds like because he's wailing away on his drums 3 feet behind you. That's normal. That's the existence for many, many, many home studio folks. What you have to do in that scenario, it's annoying, but you have to add in an extra step. So you set up the mics, you get levels, you make sure everything's not clipping, then you have him record something. Then you stop and you say, hey, stop playing, and then you listen. You can be on your headphones, but probably on your speakers or whatever's your nicest monitoring system, and you have to mute the microphone so they don't feed back because they're right behind the speakers, and you have to listen back to what you just recorded. And that's the hard part. A lot of times it sounds better. The drums sound amazing in your head while he's behind you playing because there's so much energy in the room. But when they play back just from the recording, it exposes what is good and what isn't about the recordings. And it forces you to say, okay, am I happy with this? Is this an amazing sounding snare drum? If the answer is no, go move the microphone, tune the snare, change out snares, do whatever you need to do to make that sound better. Obviously, there will always be compromises. Maybe you don't have another snare. Maybe it is in tune and this is just as good as it gets. But you at least do everything you can, including moving microphones, to get the best sound. And the way you know it's the best sound is you record something and then you listen back. That's always the process. You can skip that process if someone's in the other room and you can't hear them directly and you're just listening through your speakers, then you can just listen to them and you can make adjustments that way. But the important part is to listen to what is actually being recorded and make sure you're happy with it before you start recording takes. The biggest mistake I've made many, many times, including the story I just told you, is I'm in such a rush to start recording that I don't pay attention to obvious things like, hey, that guitar's a little out of tune. Let's just record. It sounds fine. And then I come back the next day and it's out of tune and I'm mad at myself. Or, that's not the best microphone for her voice, but I can fix it. It'll be fine. Let's go. Only to find out that the next time we recorded, I try a different microphone and it sounds amazing on her voice. And I feel like I need to go back and re-record the other one because it didn't fit her voice as well. All those types of things can happen if you get in too much of a rush. Now, the flip side is you don't want to sit there and test microphones on your singer for 3 hours to the point where her voice is completely shot and you've auditioned 17 microphones and you found the perfect one, but now her voice is shot and her performance is going to be awful, right? That's taking it too far in the other direction. So you want to be efficient, you want to move relatively quickly, but leave time and make time to listen back to what you record every single time. Hey, there's a new guitar part. Here it is. Record it. Okay, record it really quickly. Okay, let's listen back. You know what? That would sound better on a different amp. Or you know what? Turn the amp brightness up or turn the low end down. Or why don't you try adding some distortion to that first before we lay it down? All those things have to happen. And there are a million decisions that need to be made. And making decisions it takes a lot of energy. So by the time if you have a long marathon recording day, towards the end of the day is when you're going to make probably the most mistakes and you're going to miss things. So if you have a habit and a process of always listening back to what you recorded before you commit to it, you'll be in good shape. Now, if you're doing a recording session for drums, you do all this at the beginning of the day, you listen back to everything. At that point, yeah, you could just move on to the next song. As long as everything still sounds good and they're not changing out drum kits or changing out snare drums or completely changing how they play. If it's pretty consistent, then yeah, of course, you don't have to sit there and say, all right, now record this and let's listen back. You just did that 10 minutes ago on the previous song. You know it's okay. So that's not what I'm talking about. But I am talking about when you're recording something new. Okay, he pulls out his acoustic guitar, you put a mic on there. Absolutely record a little bit and listen back because there are about 15 different mic positions that may work on that acoustic guitar and you've got to find it. And chances are the very first position you choose may not be the right one. So I hope I've given you some things to think about. I hope that makes you more excited about the recording process. It does for me. I know it sounds like more work, but for me, it sounds like it's more work that is beneficial and that will make it for less work in the mixing phase. If I record everything well, man, mixing becomes really fast and easy, and I feel like a genius. So for me, the amount of work you put into the recording phase, absolutely pays off in the mixing phase. But it's not the other way around. If you don't put in much work in the recording phase with a plan to put in a ton of work in the mixing phase, at best it's going to sound mediocre, in my opinion. You can't mix your way out of a bad recording, but you can record your way out of being a bad mixer, right? So if you're not great at mixing, make killer recordings. That way you don't have much to mess up. The other way around, it just doesn't work as well. Okay, that's it for part 2 of this cute little 3-part series on the Mickey Mouse ears of recording, my recording process. Hope this was helpful for you. If you missed part 1, there'll be a link below. Be sure to go check that out. And then in the following video, we will move out of the recording phase. Assuming we've gotten it right at the source. Now we're going to move into mixing and mastering and talk about some important concepts with that as well. And then we'll be done and you'll be ready to go release some epic music. Thanks for watching. See ya.